Hello, YouTubers. This is a new session where we get to start talking about versioning in software. Versioning is really important to help you manage the software that you release and produce for your end users and consumers, whether they are systems or actual people or platforms that are actually built on top of what you're building, or maybe hybrid, where both people and systems are using your software to make sure that the expectations are clear, to make sure that you have backwards compatibility, to make sure that when people decide to shift from one version to the next, they are fully aware of what they're actually walking into. This particular session is not exactly this is the school of thought of the standard, right? This is not a particular way that's already existing out there or a particular pattern that someone else is using. This is exclusive to the standard kind of software that we build, with the community and open source space, and also the people that kind of adhere to the standard to build proprietary software. I want to press on three important things when we are talking about versioning. The biggest one and the most important one is that to understand, what to version. Not everything needs a version, and when to version and how to version it. These three things. So let's just kind of, start from the top. This is what to version, when you should version, and how you do that, how to version your software. Let's just take it from the top. What to version. Versioning kind of actually impacts three different things, right? Let's just kind of take it one by one. I'll put these guys away here just for, so we can pick them up later and then go over there. So what to version, right? You have three things that you actually have to version all the time. Every time you have a particular certain, well, not all the time, but every time you have a certain change in your software, you want to focus on targeting the right component that you want to version. So when you're versioning either the model that you're working with. Remember, according to the standard, there are models, routines, and the container, which is the purpose where the models and routines interact with each other. And then there's the routine, right? And then there's the container, right? And these three things are the things that you want to look at every time you're making a change. There is no change. Remember this. There's no change that will ever happen in your software that will not trigger a version update, right? Whether it's a feature, a new feature, a new rule, a new capability, a bug fix, or even something as simple as just upgrading a configuration. Even when you upgrade a configuration in your software, you have to kind of trigger a version. And we'll talk about that in the win area. But for now, what do we mean by a model? Well, let's say assume that you have a student model, right? You have a class like this, and that class is called the student model, right? And that student model has an ID and it has a name, right? And you agreed with that, and that's your version 0. So that's this student basically is the equivalent of saying v0 like that, right? But because it's 0, we don't mention it, right? We don't have to say v0 for the first iteration of anything. So your student model, you kind of, you released your system and, everything is working well. And then someone came later and said, hey, can we also add the date of birth to our student model, right? So instead of having ID and name, I want to go add a date of birth. A lot of engineers will go and say, oh, I know how to fix that problem. Let me add another property in here. That's very bad. Do not do that. Because what this means is that your existing customers that are relying on that particular model will break because your model has changed and maybe the date of birth of mandatory and their existing systems that they built on top of your existing model are not sending that date of birth, and then you end up in a situation where the systems are breaking. You should never ever add to an additional model. It's open for extension, closed for modification, meaning that if a new change has happened to your model in terms of properties of the data that you added on, even if you're attaching a new, model or you're attaching a new thing to it, you have to always think about versioning. So instead of doing that, you want to basically take a copy of this guy and basically push forward into the new version. And that new version would be student v1. Why? Because that first one was v0, right? This is a zero-based versioning according to the standard. So that's V1, and that's exactly how you name it, student V1 in your model. So now your student V1 will have the date of birth, in there, and you can easily, kind of start migrating and agreeing, that, your systems are basically working with this model instead of that model. Since we're talking about the model upgrade, someone might say, well, Hassan, does this mean that I need to basically update all my existing methods, my brokers, my services, my controllers, or whatever exposure layer that I have to adhere to use V1 instead of student, which is V0? Absolutely not. This is where we come to the routine. In the routine, let's say you have this is your service, right? This is your service here, and this was called student service, like that, student service, right? Or student broker or a student controller, whatever the case may be. You're upgrading the model, therefore the container, the service that's kind of helping you with this is going to also upgrade. So it's going to be student V1 service. So as you're naming your model, student service, student V1, this will be also student V1 service. So as the model upgrades, so will your exposure layers and containers. But what happens, so this is the model part. What happens when the model stays the same? Let's look at this model here. It says ID and name, right? But at some point in time, the name was not required, and you made it required. So you changed the behavior on the same model. So the model's still the same, but the behavior is changing. Do you upgrade the model for that? No, you don't upgrade the model. You keep the model as is, but you create a new version of the routine. And I'm going to show you in a second what that means. If you have a method, let's say you have a method here called add student async, like that, right? What happens is, if you upgrade the behavior, you should never change your existing method. You should add a minor version to it, which basically make this add student v1 async. So you don't change the existing method that you have, you upgrade to a new method, and then you start telling your existing customers to upgrade to the new method. So someone might say, well, Hassan, if I do the student v1 and I'm carrying over this validation, that's fine. Then you're going to have a thing in here called add student, like this v1, and then async alone, because you're carrying over, like this is the initial state, of this particular routine or method. Does that make sense? Now, it's really important for you to understand, like, naming conventions and versioning when it comes to brokers and methods and exposure layer differ, right? Like, for instance, if this student service v1 is basically, I'm going to take away the arrow here so you don't think that, this is service 1 calling service 0 or whatever. Let's say you added a controller in here. So let's say you have something called, student v1's controller, like that. So this is your new student controller, and you have this thing going on. Okay, that's great. You're exposing a method in here called post student async. So post student v1 async, like that. What would the endpoint for that look like? Now bear with me. This guy is calling this guy. That's true. Like, this guy is calling your student controller. If this is that first initial release on a v1, then your endpoint will look something like this. Watch this. It would be API slash v1.0 slash students. You see what I'm saying? So the first number represents the model version. The second number will represent the routine version, right? Which means that if you come up with a new version for this iteration, like say student v1 like that, right? That basically means that you need a new endpoint on your controller that says post student v1 like that, and then your endpoint will basically be called API v1.1 slash students, right? So that means your routine, the behavior change, you're going to upgrade the minor version. The model change, you're going to upgrade the major version. So 1.1, meaning you're working with model v1, and routine V1. It'll make it a lot easier for your consumer or your client to be able to kind of migrate from a previous behavior to a new behavior without having any issues in between. Now, of course, this all depends on a very critical and a very good detection of what is a feature and what is a bug and what can be a hybrid in between. Like being able to detach and be able to break the difference between what is a feature ask versus what a behavior ask and how many customers and clients that would break. Again, we're talking enterprise software development, but obviously it applies to, any smaller system that you might be building, so you don't get yourself kind of confused. Okay, so what about the container then? The container can be anything. It can be an API, it can be a library, it can be whatever the case may be. Let's say, for instance, you're releasing, with every release you're making, you're basically going and saying, I have a major, minor here, major, minor, releases and versions, and then you have maybe a build number if you like to add a build number in here. So usually when people kind of release software, they'd be like, okay, version 1.2, 0.3, 0.4, like that, or 0.5, right? When do you name these? Well, in here, if you're changing your model, you should probably upgrade this version every time. It doesn't matter which model on your service that you're building. If you upgrade a new model, like you're offering a new API slash v2 point whatever, you should probably upgrade this version. So I'm going to put here the word here model. This model upgrade. You already upgraded your model. Okay, great. Usually there's a dot in between. This happens with everything that you build, whether it's a library or an API, whatever the case may be. You're changing a behavior anywhere, right? That a routine like that, you're upgrading this version here. So routine, upgrading this or that. Okay. Now the last one here is what when you fix a bug. If you can actually determine, well, I don't need a new version for the model, and I don't need a new version for the method, but there was a bug. We detected a bug that was missing, something that's not handled or a condition that was not taken care of or whatever the case may be. That's here when you basically go and say, oh, this here is an iteration where we fix the bug. What about this last one? This last one, it's up to you. Like I don't mandate it because I like the number 3. I don't want you to add more than 3 numbers in your version. But this last one would be here every time you do a build. So every time you do a build number, you iterate and you build, right? It will go and basically set that. By the way, this version here is not exclusive to bugs. It would apply to things like configs, for instance. Like you say, let's say for instance you upgraded, I don't know, some library, right? The library has, version X and you made it X, +1. It doesn't matter. Smaller changes that don't necessarily impact your model or your routine. Something that doesn't impact your business logic. Which means that at the exposure layer, everyone should start having something called API slash version. If it's a RESTful API endpoint, you should probably say API slash version. Like what's the version of the actual service as a whole? Like not the API itself, but the version as a whole, like the whole container, the whole, your ASP.NET or whatever container that runs the whole show, right? This version should basically express all these 3 things that I talked about: model, routine, and bug or configuration as you see fit, right? Okay, so that's what you're versioning. You're versioning a student, you're versioning a routine, you're versioning a container just like that. But we also touched about when to version, right? When you are versioning, when you need to add a new property, when you need to add a new routine or a new model into your system, that's basically if the routine is changing, the behavior is changing, and you know that the behavior is changing, you want to go ahead and do that. Now, some people might say, well, when you are missing a validation, you missed a validation rule, right? And you already released to production, right? And you want to add a new validation rule. From a business perspective, it's a bug because it's a missed requirement, right? But you can't possibly go and say, I'm going to change the code itself, right, to kind of support this new requirement because everybody else already consumed your API in production will break. You're going to cause a mass outage and a mass issue. Instead, you want to deprecate. You're going to start telling people, okay, we're deprecating this particular version of that method or that model, and we are moving on to a new version, a new model that actually, has this additional capability or new, routine. All right. Now, we basically basically covered all of them. So basically, these are the things that you basically want to think about when it comes to changing behaviors and changing. Unfortunately, not our open source. Some of non-open source projects are already adapting the versioning standpoint, but this is basically something you should probably try today in terms of versioning, how you can determine certain capabilities and certain additions or modifications to a particular model will change. You should never basically go and say, oh, I need to add this new property. Let me go and modify my existing model to kind of fit that particular description. One last thing, which might be not very common and very weird for the engineering community, is that what if you are building an endpoint in here like that? So your endpoint in here is basically at this model here, like let's say, at this student, that first model in here, you're building an endpoint for this model. Well, that endpoint is basically called API like that slash students. There is no version because it's 0, 0. But if you change the behavior of something on that endpoint, you want to go and say API slash V01. Nobody does this today, but we do because there's a standard that guides, what really changes. Like if the behavior changed, but you're still working with the same model, you should basically say V0.1, just like that. So you know exactly that you are targeting a particular behavior, upgrade and a particular, and trust me, the API endpoints will kind of support that behavior as you move forward. This is a quick session. I will start adding documentation in the standard book to kind of cover versioning from a high level perspective and kind of give you some examples at the services level, at the brokers level, at the exposure level. Also when you're building a library or you're building an API, whatever exposure layer, you should always allow people, and you see this everywhere. Like if any professional that's building something for people to use, if I go in here and basically just literally just pick up something like a command line like this, and you go and type, I don't know, .NET dash 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 version. See, you'll always see someone adding a version. There is your major, minor, and then there is, build number or fixed number, whatever. And then people go wild with these versions. You see, some people will put in letters and they will put, I should probably upgrade my .NET version, but you'll see people adding all kinds of craziness, in the versions numbers, right, to kind of handle some specific edge cases or something like that. For the time being, the standard is major model, minor routine, and the version, the third version number would basically cover configuration, bug fixes, library upgrades, whatever the case may be. Everything is covered through a change, and that change is source controlled. I hope this kind of just triggers your kind of imagination about scenarios where you could have used versioning to prevent an issue from happening. There is certain ways you can actually educate your customers and the people that are using your system today about how to use a particular a version in your system. Like for instance, let me just kind of open a quick demo here that I was working on last week. And let me just show you here some capabilities that you can do. So this is your code, right? You're basically adding in, this is when I was demoing the event highway and whatnot. Let's say you want to deprecate a model. So you basically want to go here. Can I kind of go here and say deprecate, or is it only at the method level? Let's see if I put a method in here. So public void foo, right? And then I want to go in here and say deprecated like that, or deprecation or something like that. Deprecation. Let's ask Copilot. Let's see. Mark this method as deprecated. There's a specific obsolete. Okay, that's what it is. So obsolete, and you basically go and say, please upgrade to foo v1, right? Can I go here and say public void foo v1? Yeah, I can. Can I reference it? That would be really cool to do something like that. I don't know if you can reference something like this, because ideally you want to basically say, oh, use this method, and then click here and it'll take you to the documentation of this method. Can I do the same thing if I put it at the class level? Oh yeah, I can definitely use this. I can basically go say some event v1, Please upgrade some event v1. This is new though. Do you see that little scratch? Right? That little scratch on the method. That's pretty cool. That shout out to, Visual Studio, Syed Hashimi team, all these folks. That's amazing. I like this a lot. If you're not gonna read the document, you're definitely gonna read this. I wonder what it would look like if you go and say some event equal new, some event. Now watch the documentation for this. Do you see that little pop up on the side? It says deprecated, right? And even when you're using it, it'll basically kind of do that nice little scratch, to tell you, hey, by the way, this is deprecated. It's annoying, and it's intentionally annoying because if I hover over it, it'll be like, hey, go ahead and upgrade to some event, v1. But that's basically how you basically do deprecation. Unfortunately, in the API world, right, you can't send that warning. If someone is calling an API endpoint, you basically want to manually send an announcement. There's no nice programmatic way of sending a warning, but that might be another thing that the standard community can work on to standardize reporting errors and messaging, through API endpoint that are truly returning what 200, 200, okay, but maybe I can send you like an error message. Actually, speaking of that, there might be an HTTP status code because that's how you would communicate something like that, right? Let's take a look here. So here is HTTP status code for deprecated or deprecation endpoint, right? Response status code. Uh, if you want to say something is deprecated, otherwise we're gonna have to create one. That's the only way for us to do that. Maybe we can ask ChatGPT, and maybe ChatGPT can help us. What is the HTTP status code for deprecated API endpoint? If there isn't one, I think we're going to have to go create one. It does not. See, that's bad, right? So this sounds like a thing that we have to kind of, as a community, to work on and basically report something is deprecated. Still 200, but it's saying, by the way, this is deprecated. You need to start working on that. I'm assuming the reason why people don't want to go the HTTP status code route is because some people look specifically for 200 or 201 OK, and if they change the status code, they'll definitely break their customers or clients' API endpoints and kind of consumers. So it's something for the community to think about. I hope you find this a little bit insightful and useful. If you have any questions, comments, concerns, please feel free to drop a comment in the comment section. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Donate to our cause. Thank you so much. Take care. Talk to you later.